Elon Musk.
I don't ever give up.
Elon Musk.
And then just work like hell.
Elon Musk.
I read a lot of books, talked to a lot of people, and have a great team.
I have spent years studying Elon Musk. I've listened to every podcast he's been on, watched all the speeches he has given, read every book I could get my hands on of him, and after spending probably hundreds of hours studying this guy, I found something that made it all click for me for how he's able to be so successful. It's a single habit that he's used for everything that he's ever done, whether it's making cars or making rockets. This habit that we're about to go over today is one that you've probably already heard of, but it's a weird one because although most people have heard of it, almost no one seems to use it. Because if people actually did apply this habit in their life, then we would see way more Elons walking around the earth. So if you're someone like me, someone who is constantly wondering what it really is that makes people like Elon such remarkable geniuses, this video will not only help you understand how he thinks, but also how to apply this habit in your own life. Because here's the thing, the way that Elon thinks, it's not something that he was born with or that's genetic or that was gifted to him, but it's something that everyone can develop. It's a sort of mental framework that will help you think through things. And it's that way of thinking that makes everything that he does so great. Which leads me to the first point in the video, the difference between Elon Musk and everyone else. The difference between Elon Musk and everyone else, it's not genetic or how hard he works, even though he is an outlier in both of those dimensions, but what it really comes down to is the way that he thinks. And the way that he thinks boils down to a single core philosophy that he applies in everything that he does. Let me give you an analogy to explain. Imagine someone cooking a meal. So they have their cookbook and they buy all the ingredients that they need and they get their kitchen ready. Now most people would take all of those ingredients, they would take their cookbook and they would start cooking their meal. But then you have the people that go above and beyond. These people will take these ingredients and go through the process and also create a very nice meal, but they also add their own flavor to it. They add some extra garlic or some extra cilantro in there to really spice it up. But then you have people like Elon who will completely tear apart the recipe and start completely from scratch. People like Elon will look at every ingredient separately and ask, what is the purpose of this ingredient and how does it affect the final taste of the meal? Or to be said in another way, what is the purpose of this part and how does it affect the final interaction with the consumer? This analogy is the perfect way to describe why Elon is so different, because when he delves into something, he doesn't just delve into the top layer, he doesn't just follow the rules, but he questions everything. He starts completely from scratch. He looks at all the tiny little details. Steve Jobs was very similar, and he once said, when you grow up, you tend to get told that the world is the way it is, and your life is just to live your life inside the world. Try not to bash into the walls too much. Try to have a nice family, have fun, save a little money. That's a very limited life. Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact, and that is that everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you. This is exactly what separates the Jobs and the Musks of the world from everyone else. It's this way of thinking of bashing into the walls of reality, of questioning all the rules around them, of molding the world into what they have in their mind. When you look at history, it's not just some, but all of the great geniuses and innovators that did this. When Einstein was figuring out his special relativity, there was already a standard model of physics, but he came along and completely destroyed that by coming up with his own model of the universe, which was curved by mass. Isaac Newton did almost the exact same thing to physics centuries earlier, not only when he invented calculus, but also when he came up with his Newtonian mechanics. And the craziest part is that after Einstein, there was this guy named Niels Bohr, and he did the exact same thing to Einstein that Einstein did to Newton by presenting the foundation for quantum mechanics. See what's going on here? It's a cycle of thinking that happens over and over and over again. But you might be asking, what does this all have to do with Elon? And the answer is that the exact same type of thinking that destroyed Einstein's way of thinking and Newton's way of thinking is the way Elon thinks about thinking. Did that sentence even make any sense? I hope it did. The point is that this habit or this way of thinking is something that repeats over and over again throughout history. Isaac Newton actually said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." And Einstein said, "No amount of experimentation can ever prove me right. A single experiment can prove me wrong." These geniuses understood that this type of thinking is the type of thinking that changes the world. And it's also probably the true way of scientific thinking. It's a bit crazy because you would think that you would be taught how to think in school, but it's actually the opposite of that. Going back to the cooking example from earlier, in school you're taught how to read a recipe. You're taught how to read a recipe, how to follow it to its exact precision, how to copy it and annotate it. You might even be taught how to write a recipe, but what you're not taught is how to question a recipe, how to look beyond the ingredients of the page and ask yourself the question if they should even be there at all. Unfortunately, most of what you're taught in the school system goes back to this one Rockefeller quote: "I don't want a nation of thinkers, I want a nation of workers." And so if you want to think like Elon, then you have to rewire your brain to think less in the way of following the recipe and more in the way of questioning the recipe. Every great person in history has come to this realization at some point that they can't just follow the recipe, but they need a way to recreate it from scratch. And I know I've been bashing on following the recipe, but following the recipe is actually a good thing. It gets you exactly where you want to go. But if you are looking to think in a way similar to Elon, then you have to understand how to go off the tracks, and this habit is going to help you do that. Now, although you've probably already heard of first principle thinking, we're going to go way more in depth. And by the end of this video, you'll not only understand how to use it and apply it in your field, but you'll also understand how to create new things and how to make things that are actually exciting and that will change the world. First, we have to talk about Elon Musk though, because Elon is the perfect person to use as an exemplary for first principle thinking. I have been obsessed with Elon for so long. I've read his Walter Isaacson biography. Of course, I read this book on the founding of PayPal, which includes a lot of him and also has my favorite quote ever. And I recently just consumed these 2 books on SpaceX. And by the end of all of this studying, I really do think that it is first principle thinking that allows him to have so much success in everything that he does. That, along with his crazy work ethic, which I'm also making a video over. Elon has this fantastic quote that perfectly describes first principles. He says, "First principles is a kind of physics way of looking at the world. And what that really means is that you boil things down to the most fundamental truths and then reason up from there." And what he really means by this is that you have to go all the way down to the ingredients of the main product. Everything starts from the base and then grows out from there. You can sort of think of it like a tree. He even said, "You can learn almost anything you want for free. The most important thing is to view knowledge as a semantic tree. Make sure you understand the trunk and big branches before you get into the leaves." In this tree analogy, then the trunk and the big branches would be like the first principles. And if you don't get the trunk or the big branches right, then your tree's gonna look all wonky. I don't think I've ever used the word wonky before. Elon is a great example of first principles because it's very clear in everything that he does, all of his products, all of his companies, even all of his decisions that he makes. He even has this thing called the algorithm at Tesla that's literally rooted in first principle thinking, and we'll go over that in a second. The reason why first principles are so important though is because that is where innovation lies. Innovation usually lies in the details, and the most important details are found in the trunk of the tree, in the base of whatever you're doing. When Elon was a kid, he would read encyclopedias from front to back. And this wasn't because he was studying for a test or anything, but it was because he wanted to understand the fundamental building blocks of reality, the base layer of reality, the first principles, the first ingredients, however you want to call it. At age 12, he even built and sold a video game that he made himself completely from scratch. This is an example of what building from first principles looks like. At Tesla, they have this thing called the algorithm, and rule 1 of the algorithm is to question every requirement. Tesla employees are not just supposed to question every requirement, but they're also supposed to know the name of the person who put that requirement in place. Because even though the requirements may look like they're set in stone, they're actually not. They're also moldable, just like reality. This is thinking from first principles. Elon is a genius, not because he knows more than anyone else, but because he questions more than anyone else. He always goes back to the first principles and he questions all of them. And like I was saying before, you probably have already heard of first principles, but we're going to do a deep dive on the concept, and we're also going to go over how to actually apply it in your own life. So let's get into that. First principle thinking goes all the way back to ancient Greece with a philosopher named Aristotle. And Aristotle said, "For we do not think that we know a thing until we are acquainted with its primary conditions, or first principles, and have carried our analysis as far as its simplest elements." What Aristotle meant by this is that we cannot truly know a subject until we have broken apart that subject into its most fundamental building blocks. So, for example, you can't truly understand an organism until you look at the cells that it's made up of, but you can't truly understand a cell until you look at the atoms that make up the cell. And you can't truly understand an atom until you look at the protons and neutrons and electrons that make up the atom, and so on and so forth. The idea is that whatever you're studying, you have to break it apart into its most fundamental form, and then question those fundamental forms. You can break down first principle thinking into 3 steps: identify the problem, break it down, and rebuild. Now, although these 3 steps sound really easy, they're quite hard to actually apply in life. Otherwise, everyone would be applying them all the time, right? So we're going to use an example from Elon's life to really get through them. The first thing you have to do is identify the problem. So the example we're going to use from Elon's life is the story from when he needed to lower the cost of a Raptor engine at SpaceX. At the time, the cost of a Raptor engine was around $2 million, which was a big problem because the Starship rocket contains around 40 of these engines, which is a lot of money. So Elon needed to drastically reduce the cost of the engine. The way Elon used first principles here is kind of genius, and that leads to step 2, break it down. Elon developed something called the idiot index, which is the total cost of a component divided by the total cost of the raw material. So for example, if a cost on the engine was $10,000, but the aluminum or steel or whatever it was to make it was only $1,000, then you have a pretty high and bad ratio. Also, if that's the case, you might be an idiot. Anyway, he broke the engine down into all of its tiny pieces, and he compared the raw material cost to the total cost. That leads to step 3, rebuild from scratch. So now he knows which parts of the engine are most expensive in terms of idiocy. This is where you really have to question everything and ask, why is this part so expensive? Do the laws of physics, do the laws of reality actually force this part to be that expensive, or what can we do to make it less expensive? You can look for a different manufacturer, you can speed up the production line in-house, you can make it in-house if you're not making it in-house already. There are all sorts of things that you can do, but the idea is to build up from the bottom, from the basic components of the engine. Because he broke the engine down into all of its tiniest parts, then you can now work on all those tiny parts separately, and that's going to improve the outcome of the whole engine. That is the whole point of first principle thinking, and the crazy part is that Elon brought the cost of the Raptor engine from $2 million all the way down to $250,000 per engine. If that isn't absolutely revolutionary, I don't know what is. This is the very basic formula for how to use first principles thinking, and every great person in history that has made a discovery of some sorts has used this. You identify the problem, you break it down into all of its constituent parts, you question everything, and then you rebuild from scratch. It's actually very simple, but like I was saying before, few people actually use it and apply it in their life. So what's stopping people from using it? The problem goes back to this quote from Elon. You have to be careful not to reason by analogy. You have to boil things down to the most fundamental truth, then reason up from there. And specifically that first part. You have to be careful not to reason by analogy. What Elon is talking about here is something called heuristics. Heuristics is a mental shortcut or rule of thumb that allows people to make decisions or solve problems quickly. You see, when you look at a problem in front of you, your mind doesn't automatically think in first principles. That would actually be extremely energy inefficient. Instead, what your brain does is it tries to come up with the fastest, least energy consuming path that it can take towards a solution. This solution that your brain finds is not always going to be the best solution. In fact, it's almost never going to be the best solution, but it's fast and it does the job. This is what Elon means when he says not to reason by analogy, because if you look at a problem and there's already a solution or a recipe right in front of you, your brain is going to automatically choose to follow the recipe. Our brains literally evolved to do that because it's incredibly energy efficient. If you didn't have heuristics, then your brain would constantly be overloaded trying to come up with new solutions for every problem that comes up. But even though your brain is wired to find the fastest and quickest and least energy consuming solution, that doesn't mean it's the best solution, and that's where first principle thinking comes in. I'm going to bring up one more thing that I probably go over in just about every video I make, but that's just how important this concept is, and it's the concept of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is that pain that you feel in your head when you do something in your learning that's not quite natural. When most people start thinking in first principles, their mind will feel their pain because they're not used to thinking in that way. Their mind is used to thinking in the way of following the recipe. This is why you have to sort of rewire and train your brain like a muscle. When you train your brain to think in first principles, to actually break things down to their most fundamental forms and rebuild everything from scratch, you can then separate yourselves from others and find new solutions that people haven't found before. Elon says, when you want to do something new, you have to apply the first principles approach. When you are doing something new, you can't just reason by analogy. You have to start from the ground up. So now that you know a bit about first principles and why people aren't quite using it, you have to understand how to apply it in your own life, because that's going to be the thing that separates you from others. It's action, right? And as always, it begins with studying how people did it in the past. The first person we can of course use as an example is Elon. Elon didn't just use the idiot index with his Raptor engine, but he has used this repeatedly throughout his life in all of his companies. With his rockets, with his cars, with the batteries in the cars, in every single one of his companies, with every single one of his products, he breaks them down into their most fundamental parts, compares the cost of the raw materials to the cost of the components, and then figures out a way to lower the price in the manufacturing line. The idiot index is one of the most powerful ways of first principle thinking, and you can clearly see in how effective his manufacturing lines are at all of his companies. I mean, they might be some of the most effective manufacturing lines in the world. Another time he was able to use first principle thinking was when he was starting to make reusable rockets. Most of the physicists and engineers at the time were completely against reusable rocket. It was sort of like a rule in the aerospace industry. They had this idea that building a reusable rocket would add too much mass and too much complexity to the rocket to cover the cost of it being reusable, and that it would make more sense to just build a new rocket every time. But Elon broke it all down into first principles. He actually broke down all the components of the rocket and compared it to the components of a reusable rocket. He added things like the mass of the propellant and the re-entry fins, and then he compared it to the amount that they would save if they recovered the booster. And just by using first principles and putting the numbers down at the spreadsheet, it's very clear that a reusable rocket could cost less than a rocket that you have to rebuild every time. It's kind of common sense when you look back at it, but at the time, no one was attempting this because no one had been looking at the first principles. Another great car manufacturer who used first principles was Henry Ford. Before Henry Ford, almost everyone was hand building their cars, like literally assembling one car at a time. This was the system that was in place, but Henry Ford applied first principles. He broke his car down into its constituent parts and realized that instead of having people work on one car at a time, he could have people work on different parts of the car at the same time. This led to Henry Ford's assembly line, which just completely skyrocketed productivity and completely separated him from any other car manufacturer. And it was all because of first principles. He saw the system that was in place, he took it apart, all of the components, and then he rebuilt that system completely from scratch. This new system is now the system that everyone else uses, and you have a new recipe that everyone else just reads and follows. The Wright brothers have an example where they were kind of forced into first principles. They were using someone else's calculations for the air and wind, and they realized that as soon as they started testing, those calculations were wrong. This meant that they had to start completely from scratch and make up their own numbers for these calculations. So they created their own wind tunnel completely from nothing, and they rebuilt all of the numbers themselves. And these new calculations, it turns out, were a lot more correct than the ones that everyone else's were using. And this is one of the reasons for why they were able to be the first humans to actually fly. One more example, because honestly, I could name examples all day, but I really like this one. It's about Steve Wozniak. You see, during the 1970s, computers at the time had all these crazy expensive chips that the computer didn't really need. Wozniak, in the nicest way possible, was kind of a computer geek. And so what he did was he took these computers and he completely shredded it to pieces. He didn't actually shred it to pieces. He just took it apart into all of its fundamental components. Then what he did was he studied each one of these pieces separately and asked the question, what does this component add to the computer as a whole? He then rebuilt the circuit completely from scratch and removed any pieces that were unnecessary. And so the computer was a lot more efficient. And this became known as the Apple I. It was a completely state-of-the-art computer at the time, and it was all because of first principle thinking. These are all examples of people who took what was in front of them, broke it down into its most fundamental parts, and then rebuilt it completely from scratch. And that's really what first principle thinking is. It's taking a look at all the components of a product and really questioning every single thing about them. Does it need to be there? What can you fix about it? What does it add to the whole? But now we get to the most important part of the video, which is how can you actually apply first principles in your own life in the 21st century? Okay, so applying first principle thinking is actually really easy because you don't have to be a genius to do it. You just have to get used to looking at the world in a different way. The first thing that you have to do is find a passion or a problem or something in the world that you have to fix. You have to have a target to aim at. This more or less has to be something that you're kind of passionate about or that you feel very strongly about because, as we said before, thinking in first principles is going to cause you mental pain. It's going to cause you this cognitive dissonance. And so if you feel strongly about it, you'll be able to hang in there and get through the pain. Steve Jobs once again has this great quote about this. Sometimes life is going to hit you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. I'm convinced that the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did. This is so important because making a new recipe from scratch or making a new system from scratch, it's going to take a lot of time, it's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take some pain. And so if you feel very strongly about it, or it's like a passion, then you'll be able to get through it. Next, you have to break down what you're looking at into its fundamental components. Most people will stop here. They simply won't go past that first level, but you really have to get to the bottom of things and break things down to the absolute most that you can break it down. If you choose some sort of tech, then really understand every piece of the gadget that you are working on. Ask the purpose of everything, question everything that's there, just break it down to its most pure form. Even if it's something more simple though, like if your problem is just that you need to get in shape, you can still break this down. Your body is simply a math equation, calories in versus calories burned. So figure out the equation and break it down into everything that you're eating throughout the day. First principles can literally be used for anything. And then finally, you can rebuild the system completely from scratch. Whether it's your new diet plan or your new workout plan or your new gadget or your new system, rebuild it completely from scratch. It has to be new. Use what you learned from breaking it down into all of its components, but make sure that it is truly new, a new system. Don't let your mind go to just following the recipe again. This is exactly what Elon has done at all of his companies, and it is the way that he thinks about everything. He is always breaking things down, and that's why he's able to be so successful. Whether it's lowering the cost of all the components of his products or scheduling his day into 5-minute blocks, he is always applying first principle thinking. And if you can take that sort of mindset and apply it in your own life, then I see no reason why you can't also go down in the history books. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Check out this video. It goes over the Feynman technique. It will make you a learning genius. Check out my website, nick.munoz, and that's it. See ya.